This conference will now be recorded.
Good afternoon. This is Bill Buckner. Welcome to that splendid little war, Military Records of the Spanish-American War. It's one of our brown bag programs, and we welcome you, and we hope that you enjoy this program. What are the value of the Spanish-American War records? In general, besides biographical, genealogical, and historical interest, what else is there that military records bring, especially this set of records? For many immigrants of the 1880s, 1890s, the Spanish-American War was the first U.S. military conflict that they might have participated in. The war records provide another set of record resources at that point of immigration to the U.S. for them. These records also provide a source to help fill in the gap of that missing 1890 census. In general, the records have been stated that the 1890 records for the Spanish-American War are more complete, descriptive, and accurate than previous records. Just a thought, as I was preparing this program, several people mentioned the collateral lines. So I know some of you may definitely know that you did not have a military ancestor in the Spanish-American War. But think about the collateral lines, those siblings, cousins, that might provide you through pension records or other types of service records, some additional information about your family. So what are our goals this afternoon? Well, one, we want to determine if our ancestor served in the war with Spain. We also want to learn what types of records are available for us to research, from service, pension, burial, state records. We want to learn some basic search strategies on how to best search for our ancestor. And we want to discover what information can be found through these types of records. At the end of the program, I will recap through a single individual some of the records that we found for that person. To put things in perspective, the Spanish-American War of 1898 fell into the post-Civil War era category from 1865 to 1917. And you can see some of the other wars that that war fell in place with. I prepared a few slides on the history of the Spanish-American War. I wanted to just present quickly, kind of get a feel of what we're looking at so that the history helps us understand what's going on. So in January of 1898, Spanish sympathizers staged riots in Havana, Cuba, and the U.S. in response to protect our citizens sent the USS Maine to the Havana harbor in Cuba. On February 15th, the USS Maine blew up with a death toll of 266, and Spain was suspected. This might be the only thing that at least I remembered from history of the Spanish-American War was about the USS Maine. Now, Spain was suspected. In March 28th, a report of the U.S. Naval Court stated that the cause of the explosion was by a mine. Further reports, one in 1976 and reissued in 1995, determined that the ship was destroyed from the inside. A burning coal bunker triggered an explosion in an adjacent magazine. I found it very interesting that we learn history, but today with the internet, you're able to find all the original reports online for something of this nature. And so as you research your family, I highly encourage you to reevaluate what we know of history, especially by looking and reading the original documents that are now available to us on the internet. This war took place, it was 109 days in the making. On April 11th, President William McKinley asked Congress for the authorization to help end the fighting in Cuba, establish a stable government. On April 20th, he signed the April 19th joint resolution by Congress to recognize the independence of the people from Cuba, and demanded that the Spanish government give up control of the island. And on April 21st, the U.S. ultimatum was presented to Spain. Relations were suspended. On April 23rd, this is an important proclamation by the president, and an act to provide temporary increase in the military establishment of the U.S. in time of war, with the establishment of 125,000 volunteers to carry out that purpose. So we'll come back to that here in a minute. On April 25th, the war was formally declared between Spain and the U.S. In May 1st, the Navy got involved, and Commodore George Dewey destroyed the entire Spanish fleet in Manila Bay in the Philippines. On June 9th through the 17th, the Battle of Guantanamo was the first land action of the U.S. and repulsed the Spanish strongholds. July 1st, U.S. and Cuban troops took El Visto Fort, the town of El Caney, and San Juan Heights, and the Rough Riders, as we know them, under Teddy Roosevelt, stormed San Juan Hill, and Santiago de Cuba surrendered on July 17th. That's probably the other thing we remember. We remember Teddy Roosevelt's Rough Riders. July 18th, after the Battle of Santiago, the Spanish government, through the French ambassador to the U.S., initiated a message to President McKinley to suspend hostilities and start negotiations to end the war. On the 12th of August, a peace protocol that ended the hostilities between Spain and the U.S. was signed in Washington, D.C. September 13th, the Spanish Cortes, this was the legislature, ratified the Protocol of Peace. 28th of November, the Spanish Commission for Peace accepted the U.S. demands in the peace treaty, and the Treaty of Peace was signed in Paris on December 10th. What we got out of it was Spain renounced rights to Cuba, allowing for Cuba's independence, succeeded Puerto Rico and the island of Guam to the U.S., and sold the Philippine Islands for $20 million to the U.S. February 4th, the Philippine insurrection began, another war, as a Philippine Republic declared war on the U.S. They just saw it as one dictator replacing another. And on February 6th, the U.S. Senate ratified the Treaty of Paris by a vote of 52 to 27. So as we start looking at this war, and as we look at any war, we need to ask ourselves who served. Were there some special groups, special people? In this case, we have the regular army, which was at about 28,000 at the start of the war. Legislature allowed for it to grow to about 61 to 65,000, but ended up around 59,000. You have a distinction between enlisted personnel and officers. We have the volunteers that volunteered, that proclamation for 200 plus thousand, 125 plus another 75 at a second time. We have officers enlisted there. We have a special group of volunteers called U.S. Volunteers, and this was part of Teddy Roosevelt's domain. It was called U.S. Volunteers. We had the Navy, and we had doctors and nurses. So President McKinley's call for volunteers was in two different issue proclamations, one for 125,000 on April 23rd, and a second one for another 75,000 on May 25th. I kept seeing quotas, and so I finally figured out what that was about, was that based on population, President McKinley telegraphed each state's representative and told them, based on their population percent, what number that they would be required to provide for this war as far as volunteers. And so there are different states. I'll point out here, Texas, we had 231 officers, 5,054 enlisted men requested for volunteers for this war. States represented, we saw at least 45 states represented, with most of the people coming from the states of New York, Illinois, Pennsylvania, and Ohio. These were highly populated areas. Now, enlistment, most volunteers enlisted through state militia, the National Guard. And so at the time we were at peace, our war numbers for military were down considerably for what they expected that they would need to fight Spain. And so the thought was to use the National Guard, to have those enlisted volunteers come from the state militia, and state militia could, as units, apply as volunteer units and move into the federal domain. So the people had to be between 18 and 45, serve the duration of the war, but no more than 2 years, and units were discharged as a whole. So as we see record sets, whole units were discharged just as it says at the same date. Question to myself was, the Philippine insurgents started right after this war. Did volunteers or the regular army serve? And we'll get to that question later. Also, since the militia were moved or requested for volunteers or asked to volunteer for this war, the state adjutant general records from those states would be important. So my question to you would be, what state did your ancestor live in 1880 and 1900 to give you a focal point on where to look for those types of records? So our first step is determine really if your ancestor served in the military. Additionally, the first steps in searching for military records of an ancestor is to determine if he served and what branch, rank, unit. So you have to look for clues in military records through following records. So what kind of records might you have? You might have family stories or family traditions that somebody in your family served in a war. Maybe it's just that's as general as it is. You know, great-grandpa served in the Spanish-American War. So those types of things get passed down from one generation to another. But you also might look for papers, family papers, memorabilia. Maybe you find a ribbon bar from a campaign medal. Maybe you find an application for a veterans group or a piece of uniform like a hat, or maybe even a photograph. So these are the kinds of things that you would want to look for in your family records to determine whether or not your ancestor may have served in this particular war or any war. You also get clues from things like death certificates, obituaries, cemetery records. Death certificates actually have a place on the application, on the death certificate, to state what war a person might have fought in. Did they die at a veterans home, or are they buried in a military cemetery? Looking at your ancestors' age and determining whether they would have been in a reasonable age to serve in a specific conflict is another way of looking at your ancestors to see what war they might have fought in. Looking for obituaries, that's another great source. So my person of interest throughout this presentation is someone named John P. Hall, and So we find that he had a military marker. And so sometimes that's the first clue that you might find out as you're looking at cemetery records to find that an ancestor fought in a war. Now, by looking at John Hall, we see a couple things. We see that his rank was a private. We see that he was in Company E of the 1st U.S. Volunteer Cavalry. Now, the distinction between the special volunteer units and just the word volunteer sometimes is not really clear. So in the records, you have to just take what you see and then try to figure it out. Definitely the war that he served and his dates of birth and death. Another source of finding out if an ancestor served might be that another generation might have served as a son of a particular veterans group or in the veterans group itself. And so after the Spanish-American War, as we see in a lot of other wars, there were various membership or veterans groups that started. After the Spanish-American War, we had the Spanish War veterans and a whole bunch of different other groups that started up, as you see there. And these all merged in 1904 to form the United Spanish War Veterans. This group lasted until 1992. And the medal you see to the right there is the medal of that particular organization. Now, Facebook pages, so here is a Sons of the Spanish-American War Veterans. There's actually an active group. I think with Facebook pages, you start seeing a lot more people being interactive with instead of just a website. People are quick to share documents they found or resources they found. And so one of our search tips is just to say that as you look at these different groups, one, you might find new resources and you might even find your particular ancestor. Now, in the census of 1930, there was a question asked whether the person is a veteran of the U.S. military or naval forces. If yes, and they asked which war or expedition. So the enumerators were to enter WW for World War I, SP for the Spanish-American War, CIV for the Civil War, PHIL for the Philippine Insurrection, etc. And so this particular census, if your ancestor was alive, you want to look at that particular census and get a feel for did they actually serve. And so this is what it would look like. Here is Dan E. Laney. And so under the category of war, he is labeled SP for Spanish American. So how old was Dan in 1898? Well, he was 41 when he went to, what was it, 18 to 45, and so he fell into that category. Birchie Shell. So how old was Birchie? Well, there it is, SP for under war, but something's not quite right. It says his age is age 14. And so I want to remind us all that we always want to evaluate the record that you find in front of you. And when things come up like this, you want to explore those a little bit more, and we'll talk about this later. Or how about a common name, like a William D. White or just a William White? So even for William D. White, initial D, born in Kentucky, we see just literally multiple people with the same name and born in the same place. And so the problem with common names is multiple entries. You want to gather as many facts as you can through your research: age, birthplace, middle initial, their name, where they possibly live now. So the more information you have, the better. So I asked myself this question: in Ancestry, is there a way to search for an ancestor with this SP as part of the as part of the search strategy? And the answer to that is yes. So 1930 census asked that question. It's not a field in the transcribed record that you see, nor is it a designated field in the ability to edit a record, edit the records through the filters. But under the keyword template, you can enter SP with no spaces, and it will search the name that you enter in the search box with SP, and this is what you find. And so for William D. White, we find that there were two entries, one from Ohio, the other one from Kentucky, that served in the Spanish-American War. So let's recap that again. So you want to enter the SP in the keyword field and with the name that you're searching, and then hit enter, and it will give you a list based on what you put in as your search terms with those that served in the Spanish-American War or whatever war that you put in first, and then the rest of them don't have that SP in it. The 1940 census also asked a question about military service, but the sad part about this, that question was only in the additional questions or the long form question, which only 5% of the population actually got and was asked. And so I spent way too much time trying to find an example. And so I will just say that if you get lucky, your ancestor was in the 1940 census, you might look here and see if they were in that special 5% of the population that got asked the additional questions. Well, how do we begin? So I've given you some places to look for information about your ancestor. Here are some things that you might want to try to keep in mind. The branch of service. Were they in the Navy? Were they in the Army? Were they in the Marines? And then within those branches, which type of unit were they in? Were they in cavalry? Were they in infantry? Were they in the batteries? Were they an officer? Which conflict? Dates of service? What rank did you know? Did you know that, of course, everybody came back from the war and they were all colonels? You know, so you have to ask yourself that question. Did your ancestor receive a pension? Do you have any clue as to that? Just some general information, military records and the value. You have service records. Service records have biographical, medical, military, rank, unit, muster, in and out dates. The record that as genealogists we really love to find are those benefit records, pension records, bounty land records. What did our ancestor get in return for serving in the military? So these types of records contain those supporting documents such as vital records, marriages, family papers, affidavits of service that really help us with our genealogy. Now, there are a couple major divisions of the military records that we're looking at. There are what they call the old military, and these are actually in the National Archive in DC. The modern military, pretty much from World War I to the present, is at the National Personnel Records Center in St. Louis. And so those are the distinctions between the two. So our war in 1898 should fall under the National Archive. And so except for the Navy, which we'll explore later, most of all the records should be with the National Archive. This is a really in-depth, so on one column here, we have the National Archive papers, and on the other is the National Personnel records. And as you look down here, like here's the Navy, officers separated after 1901, enlisted personnel separated after 1884. And so their records are going to be for the 1898 for personnel files still with the National Personnel Office, according to this document. Now this record, the compiled military service records, we're going to spend a little time looking at this. Its initials are CMSR or CSR. What is a compiled military service record? Well, the compiled military service records, these are records that I'll explain descriptively. They're in an envelope, which, as you see right now, or they call this a jacket. It will contain individual cards that have been abstracted for that particular individual service records from original records. There are also maybe an internal envelope that might include original documents, such as their enlistment papers or descriptions of being held prisoner or things of that nature. These came about from an Adjutant General, Fred Ainsworth, who started in the 1890s, 1886, I believe, is when he actually started this transcription project. And that transcription project eventually covered 6 different military wars with over 58 million records being indexed and transcribed. 2 purposes for this. One, the original records from the various wars, the Civil War, the American Revolution, over time started to deteriorate and decay. And so they wanted to find a better way to preserve those without touching them all the time. And so that's one of the reasons for these compiled military service records. It was also intended to permit rapid and efficient checking of military and medical records in connection with claims or for pensions. So these records include the Spanish-American War, which is great for our purposes today. The value of these, it's easy to access and for us to look at original records and searching for our military ancestors. Now, one of the problems is, like we saw with William D. White, we have the right name, but the wrong ancestor. It's an index problem. So when you start searching the compiled military service records, it is an index. So all you pretty much have is a name. We'll look at what's included in those records in a minute, but you need to spend your time and energy trying to determine some background information about your ancestor prior to using this index, because you could be spending your time and energy looking at the wrong person. Is your person in the index? And so we have to remember that this index for the Spanish-American War is only for volunteers. Now, one thing that we've seen over and over, so Family Search stated it well, that the records for this war became more uniform, literacy more common. So you started really seeing a higher level of literacy in the records, and so that made for better records and also for better indexing. So here's what those compiled military service records include. What you would expect: the name, the unit, and period of service. There will be a card written up for the roster or roll call or muster roll. There might be regimental returns. We'll discuss what those are. There might be hospital information, payroll information, correspondence, commissions of officers, rank information, talk information about a soldier's career, promotions, the prisoner of war, casualty information. And then some of the compiled military service records have physical description of the soldier, including name, age, height, hair, occupation, eye color, and complexion information. That's really good information to have. Now, I want to make sure we all understand that the compiled military service records, there's some confusion. And I guess maybe at some point I was confused, but so I had always heard that these were abstracted records. There are actually original documents in with the jacket. So a lot of times the registration or the signing in, the mustering in records, so there are various types of records that make their way into these jackets that are original. And then there are records like muster rolls that have been abstracted onto a card, and we'll look at that. Now, there is this fact that when someone transcribes a record, there is a risk of error. So, as I stated, that 58 million cards covering 6 wars were abstracted, and there could be errors in that amount of material. So I saw over and over in different places that people wanted to make sure people understood that you had to be careful of making assumptions based solely on these cards that are provided. And so you want to see all the cards available to you, and sometimes all the cards are not exactly available through the digital source that you're looking at. And so you just want to know and have that in the back of your head. Make sure that, you know, if you are looking at military records, you want to get all the cards. So it is basically an index. And there are some cross-reference cards that are in the material. And so here we have a Sam Kaner with 2 N's, and it's telling you basically the original records might be under Sam Kaner. Now, these card numbers are for every abstracted number or abstracted card. That card got a number, and so those numbers are somewhere typically on the back of the actual card. This is basically the basic information from the index. You have a name, and so these records are in alphabetical order. You have the rank, which is in this case, this person's a private, the war. You have which company and what unit he is with. And so that's basically all the information that you have for this individual. One thing I kept seeing was that there were these codes written on the abstracted cards that I would see. And I found a document that basically listed all these codes and what they meant. And so I want to just basically share that to help you understand what those codes might be and is there any additional information there for you. So these codes show up on the front of the major index card. And so here at the bottom circled, you'll see that. And then also they are on the back of the cards as well. So let's take a look. When you actually find your card, you might want to look the before and after card and see what else there might be in that particular file for that individual. So the Florida Spanish-American War records. This is a Thomas B. Tolman. The compiled military service records for the Spanish-American War as an index is only an index. The only full compiled records that are available that have been digitized are the records from Florida and one other surprise, which I'll share with you later. So, but once you see all the images for a particular war, you want to check all of them out as best you can. So in this case, the R and P stood for Record and Pension Office. And then the PO and the different things. pension office, military, and medical. This third one was a lost discharge record. Something else was sent in its place. And so there are some clues there that might help you understand or look for different other types of records. So even if there's nothing on the front of the card, you might want to check the back. So that's just something else you might want to do. Medical record information got carded, and for the compiled military service records of the Spanish-American War, which only applies to the volunteers of that war, the carded medical records were included in those records. And so military medical records were carded just like the service records. So this card would be in, these cards would be in with the service records themselves in the packet of information in the jacket. So to be really clear, the compiled service records have not been microfilmed except for Florida. The compiled military service index helps you understand that your ancestor was in the compiled records, and at some point you're going to have to order those records through the National Archive. Now, the compiled military service index is available from 3 major sources: Fold 3, Ancestry, and Family Search. And so they all look pretty much like they've got the same information. They just have a different look and feel when you use those products. So here is Fold 3. So you would go to Fold 3 and then come down Fold 3 database, which we have in our library and on our website. It is available to you remotely as a patron of the Waco Library. It's arranged on their major page by war, so that makes it real easy to get to. You want to look at Spanish-American War, click on Spanish-American Civil War Record Index, and then you can, at every point in time, for every screen, there's always the ability to put in a name, and so you can either once you click on it, you'll get to the record set itself, which is here, and you can put in the name of your ancestor, or you can browse by a period of time. So that's one source to do. Then for ancestry, you would get to the Spanish-American War record, and this is still in Fold 3. And so I had put in John P. Hall, and I got the index card for John P. Hall. He was in Company E, 1st U.S. Volunteer Cavalry. He was a private. Now, there were 18 other John Halls in this record set, index cards. And so I have to know something specific to be able to say, this is the John Hall that I'm looking for. Maybe a middle initial, maybe knowing what regiment he was in. But I did find also in this list that there was another John Hall that was in the same unit, 1st U.S. Volunteer Cavalry, in a different company, and he was a farrier. Now, by researching John P. Hall, I know that John P. Hall, as an occupation, was a cowboy. And so I might want to think in terms of, is this the person? Additionally, did he move from Company E to Company M? Did he use his skills as a cowboy? And so that's one thing we want to be looking at as I go along. So always evaluate what you got. Now here's ancestry. And so you find the record set that you're interested in. I put in John P. Hall. And a reminder that you can look at with ancestry in any record set, under the surname, it'll give you a drop-down menu, and you can use Soundex if you're concerned that the name that you're trying to search is complicated or might have additional errors because of the name spelling of it. So I put in John P. Hall, I get a number of hits here, and I picked the one that I think was the one that I was interested in. So it has, here he is, and same card, and I got to the same information. Just a different look and feel of the database. Now, family search, a little more complicated. So I went to resources, record resources. I put in the name of the record series. It gives me a drop-down menu. I find this record set, and then I highlight it and click on it, and then I go over here, and so I have a search screen which is standardized by family search. Put in John P. Hall. I knew that he was born in 1876, so I put that in as a birth year. And then I got my results list, and I found the hall that I was looking for. Now, at this point, I can either search by browsing, or I can actually get on the record and then find the actual index. Now, once you find your ancestor in the compiled military service index, you will need to order the actual records from the National Archive in Washington, D.C. And you can do that nowadays online, or you can print out the form, which is Form 86 for service records, and send that record in, and then they will inform you how many records there are and what the cost will be to photocopy those and get back to you. Okay. So this is what it would look like. You would take the service record information you found and then fill out the form, Form 86. Now, COVID has impacted a lot of things, and so the National Archive right now is not taking in-person or requests for copies or digitization services until further notice. So this is something you're probably going to have to do at a later date and time. Now, I wanted to plant another thought with you. With 58 million index cards for 6 different wars, there were a lot of cards of names abstracted out of records that they did not know where that name should be placed, what unit. So maybe you found a name of a person in the records, but you weren't quite sure what unit they were with. And so those were set aside for another day for someone else to figure it out. And so for the Civil War, we have unfiled cards and personal papers as even a roll of microfilm. They kept those cards, but they're just there. For the Spanish-American War, I could not find any formal record sets, but I wanted you to think in terms of whatever war you are indexing or in researching. You want to think in terms of, are there unfiled cards that you would want to try to find? Now, there are U.S. volunteer records. This was the what we called popular known as the Rough Riders. So these special regiments were raised for the Spanish-American War, and then they went away. So the president got permission to basically create 3 volunteer cavalry units, and the Rough Riders, which was 1st Volunteer Cavalry, most famous and the only one to see combat. There were 3 volunteer engineer groups, 10 volunteer infantry regiments, and 2 volunteer signal corps. Now, these volunteers, special volunteers, are indexed, both the officers and enlisted, in the compiled military service record index. Now, Rough Riders had a Texas connection, which I just wanted to pass on to you. So here is Teddy Roosevelt at one of the missions in San Antonio. He recruited the Rough Riders in San Antonio. They trained in San Antonio before they were shipped off to Cuba. Their camp was Camp Riverside, which is an area in San Antonio's south side, now home to the Roosevelt Park and Riverside Golf Course. So if you ever go to San Antonio, you can take an interest in the Rough Riders and what San Antonio had to offer. Now, this link here, I wanted to point out, for every war, there is at some point a report on the number of people mustered in, mustered out, the number of people that died of certain things. In this case, the U.S. Adjutant General created this report in like 1899. So just basically the next year after the war. And so you always want to check if you find, once you find your ancestors' unit, you want to come in and take a look and see if there's information about it in this kind of statistical report. Also, once you identify the unit, you want to do some research by researching that unit. And so I did that for the Rough Riders and found that there was a roster. And one of the things that I saw in this was that the John P. Hall where we're looking at was from Williamson County, and that he was wounded in the line of duty and sent to hospital on July 1st. And that date is the date that they stormed San Juan Hill. So that made that pretty interesting. Now, the National Archive, we would expect that they would have some information for us. And so I want to show you how to get to their catalog and how to search that out. So on their main page, which you can put in the URL or internet box at the top, you can put in the old internet URL, which was nara.gov, which converts to the new one called archives.gov. You would click on research for records, and then once you clicked on that, you would click on search the catalog, and then you would get a dialog box or place to put in information, and then you can hit advanced search. Now, as you research records, you will find the official titles for some of these or the record sets. And so I put in the title, some keywords into the Spanish-American War, and I came up with carded records showing military service of soldiers who fought in volunteer organizations. And so once again, these are only for volunteers, not regular Army. But this thing includes these different files. And so I looked at these. Now, the first one of 2,151 were for different individuals' records that have been digitized. So that would be something you would want to look at. And this second set turned out to be the first U.S. Cavalry, all the records for that particular unit, which I was extremely happy about because the John P. Hall we're looking at was in that particular unit. Now, the advanced search allows you, by clicking advanced, to put in, like, say, a name like John P. Hall, and then put in the record group. So the service records are in record group 94. And this is a result I got for John P. Hall. I got a John P. Hall military service records and the first U.S. volunteer. I also got a John Hall Congressional Medal of Honor Company B. Now, that's not the company that I knew, that I understood that he was to be in. And so, but you might want to explore that as well. Then it took me to a separate record, and down here I see that there's the payday right there, all of the compiled military service records, not just the index for this individual. And so here are some of the ones that I just pulled up a few to look at with you. So here we have muster in roll, that he was born in Williamson County. His occupation was a cowboy. He's single. Here's another one, enlistment time that he was enlisted. Muster out roll, where he mustered out. Who his Major Dodge was his officer. Again, place of residence, Williamson County. And then down here, wounded in line of duty. So we saw that from the history. Sent to the hospital July 1st of 98, and then he returned to duty in August 31st of 98. So what a wonderful bit of information for this particular person. Now, if your ancestor is not in the compiled military service records, you want to say, well, were they part of the regular Army? Is that what would they be part of that? So we have this really nice record set of enlisted personnel, and then officers as well. Just a quick fact, the 29,521 men newly enlisted in the Army for the Spanish-American War, they had to choose those amount of men from 127,000 applications. That is very patriotic. So the Register of Enlistments, we saw where are we going to go and look for information. So in searching enlisted men is in the regular Army enlistment papers. This is giving us a number, consult M233. So Ancestry has that. What's included, things we would expect, their name, place of enlistment, just the same types of information we saw with the compiled military service papers. A little research tip, soldiers may have multiple enlistment papers because they may have served more than one enlistment. Okay, so here's what it looked like in Ancestry. So I put in Army register enlistments. I came up with this record. I put in John P. Hall. Why am I doing that? Because I knew he was a volunteer, but maybe he enlisted after this war in something else. And this is what it looks like. So here's a John P. Hall, and it's 2 different pages with all this information. Now, I know that these record sets, because the person above him was in Santiago de Cuba, this John P. Hall is not my John P. Hall that I'm researching, but that's what the record looks like. Now, you remember that Birchie Shell, who we saw was age 14 in the Spanish-American War? Remember to evaluate the record. So we looked for him. He was in the Spanish-American, not the volunteer, but the enlistment. So we didn't find him in the Spanish-American volunteer records. So we looked, the question was, did he really serve in the war itself? So we did find him in the regular Army listing. There he was born in 84 from Tennessee. That's the same information that we had. He had it dishonorably discharged in 1905. He signed up in 1904. And so our thought was that his census record was miscoded. So you always need to evaluate what you find in every record that you find. Now, there's a difference between the enlisted men and officers, and so there's 2 sources I'm providing here for you, and it should be in your handout. Heitman's Historical Register, and you can find it on Internet Archive, and so it is basically a master list from just pretty much forever on officers, and so you would look that up. It's alphabetical. Another one is by PAL, and that one is also available for you to look at. Now, in the regular Army, the medical records were carded medical records. They're not online, and so you would have to go to this record set 530, RG 530, which covers the Spanish American for the regular Army, and then request those from the National Archive. Another type of record you might want to look at for different wars is court-martial records. And so these two are not, well, there are various records here. And so I'll show you that there are a few court-martial cases that are in the catalog for the National Archive. Returns themselves, I didn't quite know what a return was. And so I started looking at it, and there are regular Army unit returns and then Army post returns. Now, for enlisted men, there's not going to be a lot of information. But for officers, the returns themselves, or if you're researching the unit itself, these returns are really valuable to look at. And so Family Search is a good source for returns. This is a listing of some of the types of returns. You'll notice that they're by branches and units. And so the different regular Army, Corps of Engineers, et cetera, et cetera. And this is what, if you look in Family Search catalog, you'll find these various unit registers. And this is what one of them might look like. Very big pieces of paper with lots of different information, which you can scroll and look at. Now, pension records, what are who and what and why of our pension records? And so who is the actual veteran, their widows, their minor children. What's included might be discharge papers, documents submitted in support of a pension, affidavits attesting to service, and this is where the genealogical value comes in: family Bible, proof of marriages, children's births, death information. The National Archive has pension information from 1775 to 1916, based on the grounds of injury, illness, disability, age, and incident. Some more about the what of pension files. For those pensions after the Civil War and later, that's the category. There might also be the Bureau of Pensions did some questionnaires that were sent out in 1898 and 1915 that would contain additional genealogical information. So let's take a look at some more about pensions here. Now, a little sidebar, believe it or not, the VA is still paying out benefits for the Spanish-American War. Now, this document was created in November of 2019, not that long ago. Spanish-American War. There are 29 children receiving benefits and 36 surviving spouses still receiving VA benefits from a pension for that particular war. I thought that was really interesting. Now, there's an official period for pensions. You need to understand there's an official date period, and that's part of the CFR, Code for Federal Regulations, which is a jurisdiction for that. And so I just wanted to give you, for this particular war, these are the dates of service that a person for the Spanish-American War would have served under. So some of this would be under the Philippine insurrection, as well as the Spanish-American War. So the files themselves we're interested in are the Civil War and later. And the main index is General Index to Pension Files, and it covers these particular wars in that particular Civil War and later. Now, some people say that you should use the pensions first instead of the compiled military service records, especially if you only have just a name, because the pensions will provide you some of that genealogical information that you might be able to match up through your regular genealogy research to say that you've got the right William D. White, that sort of thing. And so some people believe that the pension records, also for the Navy, that's one of the things that they support, is that if you have a Navy person that use the pensions first instead of their compiled military service, which they're not actually, I don't think, part of. There are two major databases to look at, and so let's take a look at those. There is the General Index to Pension Files. This is T288 as far as National Archive. The cards are arranged by surname. They have the individual's unit, they have the date of service, and this is what it would look like. General Index to Pensions at Family Search. And what's included are basically the things that you would expect: name, the dependent, what company unit that they served under, the date of application, and the application or claim number. So our John P. Hall is in the General Index. Now, this covers a large period of time for pensions, and so you have to discern by the date of application. So definitely in 1890, he hadn't fought in the Spanish American yet. And so 1898 was my best choice. This is that database in Ancestry. And so it's called a little something different. It's called the Civil War Pension Index, General Index to Pension Files. And so you might miss that from the Spanish American, thinking that it was only the Civil War Pension Index. And in fact, in the description, it doesn't mention anything about Spanish American, but there's our John P. Hall. And so just note that the Civil War Pension Index is like the General Index that's on Family Search. There's a second pension file. It's an organizational index. And the value of this organizational index, it is arranged by organization first and then alphabetized within the organization. The records themselves say that they go up to only up to 1900, but they actually cover up to 1917, which is what we needed to know. So this is T289 by the National Archive number. Family Search has this organizational index under the title of United States Civil War and Later Pension Index. Once you search that for your person, you'll find that the images, when you click on the image, it pops up under fold 3 under a different database title called Civil War Pensions Index. Note that this organizational index does not include naval service. So this is what it would look like for John P. Hall under the Civil War, U.S. Civil War and Later Pension Index under Family Search. So I looked at all the John P. Halls and then found, here's the John P. Hall that I was interested in. And then once I clicked on it, it said, these images are going to be pulled up by fold 3. See here where the arrow is. And I click on that, and it pops up the John P. Hall. Now, that's great, but here's what it makes it even more interesting. Because it's an organizational index, this is pulling up Company E of the 1st U.S. Volunteer Regiment. And so the people next to him are from that particular company. And so you can go in and see and learn some more information about that particular company for whatever unit that you're interested in. Now there is another database I wanted to bring to your attention is for widows applications. In doing pension research, typically prior to 1901, if a woman received a pension and then got remarried, she lost her rights to her previous husband's pension. So a law was passed in 1901 that allowed a widow who lost her pension to either remarriage or to start collecting a pension again if she was widowed or her marriage to the new husband ended in divorce, which is good to know. And so this particular record set covers some of those widow pensions. There's a record set, and then there's also Virgil White produced a book. But in the database, this is what it looks like. It's arranged by surname. And so you can go in and look at by surname and then just kind of troll through all the surnames that you're interested in to see if any of your ancestors pop up. It's probably the best way to research that particular set. Now, pension records, like we saw for this service records, you have to order those. So the pension records themselves are not on microfilm even. They haven't been microfilmed. And so you have to fill out Form 85. And this is what that form looks like, pension bounty land warrant application, and send that off to the National Archive. Now, I will say that the Navy is special because their records are always different than everybody else's, it seems. And so under the National Archive versus National Personnel Office, just some basic information. Enlisted personnel up to 1885 at the National Archive. So that our war was in 1898. So their records are going to be at the personnel office in St. Louis. Where to begin Navy research? Well, we said the pension file may be the place that you want to search first. Maybe you'll pick up dates of service, duty stations, ship that they sailed on. And so there is a Navy pension index, special set aside Navy pensions. So it's called the Civil War and Later Index. So that's the general one that we saw for general pensions. And we also saw Navy pension files ranged by the surname. And so they are not, remember, part of the organizational index, but they would be part of the individual T288. So here is the Civil War and later as a time period. So these are the record sets with the National Archive. You have disproved pensions, you have approved pensions, and then other records, payment records that you might want to look at. So let's take a look at the U.S. Navy Pensions Index. This is with Ancestry. And so I just put in a surname Buckner to see what it would look like. So in this particular database, we see that they've combined both the approved and disproved records, and they are giving you your basic information that you need, the certificate number, file number, to order those records from the National Archive. So here is the U.S. Civil War Pension Index, and I'm looking at to show you that general index for John F. Buckner, who was in the Marines, and versus the Navy pension record. And so we see that we have a certificate number of 31643 on this general index, and then we also have that same number here in the Navy pension record. So two different databases for Navy that have the same information. The Navy one helps confirm the other. Now, Ancestry has this Navy pension index, and so here we plugged in John S. Abbott, and so we're going to find later that we were looking at widow's applications for him. Now, pension payment cards are another type of record that you will find when you're researching military records. Fold 3 has this set of records, and their records are just basically Spanish American, Civil War, U.S. veterans, and then arranged by surname and first name. These payment cards are available through Family Search. So here is, you're seeing that these payment cards apply to the Navy as well as others. And I'll show you a few of them. So here is a record from the Civil War and later for a Patrick Clayton, and same certificate number we find on this record. And this is what their payment looks like. So you can see basically there might be information about his death, about how much he was bringing in under his pension, confirming other information for you through these payment records. Again, officers are different than enlisted men, and so there are some sources here that you want to look at. Navy, Marine Corps officers for the period of time for this particular war under Fold 3. There's also what they call registries, which include officers. And so we plug in, you can see all the different particular registries that are involved in this particular database, just looking at all these different record sets that have been compiled together. And so here's what, for John S. Abbott, you would pick out the period of time and question that you're interested in. And so that's Navy. Now, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about nurses, because nurses were important in this war. Civil War, then we had this war. And so first of all, we see that in a death certificate, here's for this person, Ann Ferguson. She served under the Spanish-American War, and she was a nurse. And so what more can we find? So through Find a Grave, I found a record that said she was a Civil War nurse, confirming that. So let's take a look at the medical aspect of nurses and doctors. So between the Civil War and Spanish-American War, nursing was done entirely by men. In March of 1898, they had 592 hospital corps men in various states, barely adequate for the then 25,000 peacetime force. Knowing that they were going to need a lot more trained nurses in the hospital corps, that U.S. Congress gave authorization to the Surgeon General Sternberg to employ nurses under contract. Now, what did the DAR have to do with the Spanish-American War? Yep, the right place, right time. Little interesting fact, DAR Vice President General Dr. Anita Newcomb McGee, she discussed the readiness of the DAR to compile a complete roster of approved nurses with Surgeon General of the Army Sternberg. As a result, McGee was appointed director of the DAR Hospital Corps, and the DAR took on the task of screening and selecting applications. They examined more than 5,000 applications. They had certain qualifications that they wanted. And so this is just some more history. 1,081 were certified. There was also a group of nurses in this war called religious sisters. And so religious sister nurses were part of the Civil War. And so they asked the different Sisters of Charity and different groups to supply some nurses. Also, yellow fever was appeared in the San Diego troops, and so they went to New Orleans and procured people that were immune from yellow fever, that had survived yellow fever as nurses. Positive outcome of all this, Dr. McGee was appointed acting assistant surgeon in the U.S., and placed in charge of Army nurses. She helped prepare the nursing corps that was formed in 1901. Now, there are various record sets that have information about nurses, and all of these you would have to, nothing is online, so you would have to actually request information from the National Archive. Now, once again, we go into the catalog of the National Archive. I put in Spanish American War nurses and a record set that we saw of 112. Let's see here. I went the wrong direction. So record group 112, that's what we got out of that. And we get to these individual record sets, and once you click on some of these, then you can see where you should contact for that particular record set. And it also helps, gives you additional information as to what box the ancestor you're looking for might be in, so you can get a better feel for where the records might be when you request them. Now, that organizational index that we talked about earlier, the nurses are in that under like medical department, U.S. volunteers. And so we can see here we have one of the sister nurses who got married. We have two other nurses that give their former names and married names now. And so once again, you can research those nurses as a unit. So state records, what do we think about state records? So we saw that the militia, they asked the militia of each state to provide volunteers. And so those records, the state adjutant general records, are going to be important. We'll see muster rolls, service records. So let's take a quick look at these. So here's an example of New York, Spanish-American War on Ancestry. And these cards or service cards for different people. Here is a gentleman that signed up in 1898, discharged. He signed up again in 1899. Same person. So good information there. Ancestry has a couple of other states for Connecticut, Minnesota, and North Carolina in their database. Here's an example of a state archive. Pennsylvania, same type of card, information provided. Georgia has a great source for Georgia records. Our state library, so there's a source there for those that served during this war for the state of Texas. And now there's another type of record besides these service cards. There are the archival records of all these different units that will typically show up in a state archives records. And so you want to look at those if you're interested in a particular unit. And don't forget state and county historical societies. So Kansas Historical is the organization that has taken on the Spanish-American War service cards for Kansas. Minnesota also shows us all the different types of records. Now, these are not online. They're in print form. They would have a finding aid, which will give you some basic information and then allow you to talk to someone from that organization to order some records. This is a great site. Also, when we're looking at state information, it's got all kinds of good information in it, but it has a nice collection of histories, bibliographies, unit rosters. And so here is a unit roster. You have officers, enlisted men that have been put together. And this was something new that I came across when I was just researching in general. The medals that were given out were actually identified by number and by name and unit. And so some government record has that information, and people have abstracted it out either online, which is, here's an example, or in book form. And so as I looked at different wars and different medals, I came across different sites that would have these types of listings. And so you could actually look your ancestor up to see if they were supposed to have gotten a particular medal which I thought was extremely interesting. Burial and death information. Of course, we've seen death records, newspapers, obituaries. So let's take a look at death and burial information. So our search for our John P. Hall in the Spanish-American War. You always want to look at the reverse side of anything that you're looking at. And so just that information. Buried at Mount Olivet Cemetery. Don't forget newspapers, great, besides obituaries or special reports. So you want to, search out your ancestors, search out the unit in which they served. Military cemeteries. So the National Cemetery Administration is run by the Veterans Affairs. There's actually the Army, Department of the Army has a number of national cemeteries. The American Battle Monuments Commission, you may have heard of that, and then state veteran cemeteries. So just to note that the National Cemetery Administration, major player, has 144 national cemeteries in 40 states and Puerto Rico. Note that not every state has a national cemetery. The Army has a total of 37 Army cemeteries. So like West Point Cemetery, Arlington is actually an Army cemetery. And so they're in charge of a lot of these are post types of cemeteries. So here is like Fort Sill Post Cemetery in Oklahoma was recently moved to the National Cemetery Administration. So a lot of the Army ones are post cemeteries. American Battle Monuments Commission, to clarify, these are pretty much World War I and II cemeteries overseas. I did find a reference to this particular cemetery, Clark Air Force Base Cemetery, that has in the Philippines. So I found that actually through Find a Grave. And so just to note that there are a few under the American Battle Monuments Commission that might be interesting. Big thing I learned was state versus national cemetery groups. There's a difference. So state veteran affairs cemeteries are different from the National Cemetery Association. The state veteran cemeteries are run solely by the states. Now, a little bit of digging, I found a nice listing for the state veterans cemeteries. The one outside of Killeen, I thought was a national cemetery. It's a veteran cemetery, but it's run by the state. And then versus national. I will make the assumption that there are listings like this for pretty much every state in the union. Headstones, interments. This was a new database I found in Ancestry called U.S. National Cemetery Interment Control Forms that apply to these types of cemeteries. And so here is an interment record of a person being buried. This was from an individual from the battleship Maine. Let's take a look at some of these other records. So here is a Clark Churchman that was buried at West Point. So that one is controlled by the Army. This other record is from Find a Grave. William P. McCartney, this was a record of interment. He was buried in Puerto Rico, disinterred, and then sent to Clark's Mills, Pennsylvania. And we find a record in Find a Grave for where Clark's Mill, where he was sent to the cemetery of Perry Chapel. Okay. Here is a Patrick Clark from Hampton, Virginia National Cemetery. So this is a national cemetery. We have a difference in the record for Find a Grave versus the actual interment. Which one do you use? Now, the interment record, I would go with as a primary record versus possibly this is a, maybe not even what's on the tombstone, I don't know, but a secondary type of record. So we looked at the grave locator database for national cemeteries. And so the date of 1929 versus 1920, this is probably a mistake. And so that's another way to look this grave locator database. So the nationwide gravesite locator is for national cemeteries, state veteran cemeteries, and other types of militaries, including private cemeteries. So if the person got a military marker, you would want to look at this particular database if they were in the military. So here's William McCartney and gravesite locator. Both of these are not the one that we're looking for. I put Ann back up here because I just want to point out that Family Search does not allow you to search like the epitaphs, which like Spanish American War nurse. So there was no way for me to sort out, put a name in, and just search for Spanish American and find a grave. Now, again, that website that we looked at before for muster rolls and stuff has a really nice project. It's a Spanish American War gravesite recording project. So it's by state, and people are adding to this database currently. So they have a total of 15,708 graves with connections to that particular Spanish American War. I provided this site because a lot of people want to know how you get your free tombstone, how do you request, a burial if you're a veteran, and so this is the website to go and look at that. Now, headstone applications fall into various categories usually by date. So in 1873, Congress provided burial a right to have a tombstone, including those that were in the Confederacy. And so let's take a quick look at those. Family Search has a database from 1925 to 49. So I put in my John P. Hall. Why didn't I find him? Well, because he died in 57, and so even this would have been before he even died. And so this is what an example of one of those applications for that particular period of time would look like. And then there's also from 1861 to 1904 on Ancestry. Note the cards look a little bit different, and we can find some information here about this person's in the gravesite locator for National Cemetery. And this is what it looks like. And if we compare, we've got our compiled military service record, and we've got a request for a headstone. So here is in Ancestry, another database headstone applications covering the period of time that we're interested in. And here we find our John P. Hall. Some things to note on this headstone application: enlistment date, discharge date. He's a Christian. We have the date of the application, and we find out that the person requesting it is his sister, somewhere on there. So there's a lot of good genealogical information in these types of records. And don't forget always to check the back of the record. Now, just a couple of slides on the Philippine insurrection. So after basically the Spanish-American War was over at the Treaty of Paris on December 10th of 1898, the Philippine government did not like the fact that basically one group of people taking over their country was replaced by another. And so there were rebels that started conflict with the U.S., and this skirmish started in February 4th of 1899. And so you remember that in the pension applications, this went all the way to 1904. And so just the word that you're going to find that there's information there for you. These two wars kind of ran together, and so the people that were researching may have fought in both wars and have records in both wars. So they allowed, required additional volunteer forces. So the regular army Regular Army was approved at 65,000, and 35,000 volunteers were added for this particular war. And so you'll see a lot of soldiers that went straight into this conflict. So just really quickly, I wanted to do a search for John P. Hall, show you kind of some of the records that we found. We had it started with a death certificate, then a military marker, the application for that marker. We looked at the compiled military service records and found that he had a compiled military service, possibly a duplicate in a different unit. We did some history on the regiment and found some new information that he was from Williamson County and that he was wounded in the war on the day that they stormed San Juan Hill. We searched the National Catalog for him directly and found that he had his compiled military service records digitized online, and we were able to get all those records. We also found that because of his disability, he was wounded, I guess, that he got a pension. And so we find that record and we can go and request a pension application. And we do that from Form 85. And the last thing I found was that he was drafted for World War I, and so that gave additional information about where he was and that sort of information. Now, the reason I used John P. Hall was because we found in our records, as we were doing some cleaning up, a scrolled up piece of document for a copy of John P. Hall citation from the Cuban government, and he must have been sent this particular medal from that government. And so we want to salute you, John P. Hall, for your service, and thank you for allowing us to use you as an example. I want to thank you for your time and bearing with us, and we'll hopefully see you again here at the Genealogy Center. Thank you.